The night wind carried a low hum over Tapachula, the southern gate of Mexico. Beneath flickering floodlights, buses lined the road like silent witnesses. Their engines idled, waiting, not for passengers, but for deportees. Marisol pressed her face against the barred window of the migrant shelter, eyes tracing the silver ribbon of headlights disappearing into the dark. 2 nights ago, she had been promised a hearing. Tonight, she was told to pack. Somewhere in her chest, hope and fear fought for air. She remembered her daughter's last words through a shaky phone line, "Mama, did you find work yet?" She'd lied, whispering, "Soon, mi amor." But now that soon was being loaded onto buses bound south, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, each route a different kind of heartbreak. No one outside really saw what was happening here. News bulletins spoke in numbers, thousands deported in coordinated sweeps across southern Mexico, but inside these walls, the numbers had faces, dreams, families. In the corner, a boy no older than 16 folded a scrap of paper into a paper crane. "They said we're going back tomorrow," he murmured. Marisol nodded, unable to answer. She'd heard the same words all day. When she asked the guard if she could call her family before leaving, he shrugged, "Phones are for those who are staying." For a moment, she thought about running, again. But where to? North meant arrest, south meant danger. There was no safe direction left. As she closed her eyes, she wondered, how many of them would survive the journey back? How many stories would be buried at the borders, unheard and unnamed? It's a question that lingers in every corridor of this story, one that asks us quietly, if desperation became your only passport, how far would you go before turning back? Outside, the rain began to fall. Each drop against the tin roof sounded like a verdict. Marisol wasn't alone. Across Mexico, mass deportations were unfolding at an unprecedented scale. Officials confirmed that Mexico had started returning thousands of migrants to Central America, part of a broad agreement to slow the northbound surge. The policy was presented as order, but on the ground, it looked like chaos. In makeshift camps near Tennessee, families huddled beneath tarps, whispering stories of being taken from shelters in midnight raids. In Reynosa, volunteers spoke of children vanishing between checkpoints. And in Ciudad Hidalgo, deportation buses crossed the Suchiate River every morning, empty one way, full the other. For the officers processing the returns, it was routine. For those inside, it was the unraveling of entire lives. Marisol gripped the strap of her worn backpack. Inside it were 3 things: her daughter's photo, a half-eaten packet of crackers, and a folded note that read, "Don't give up before you see the sunrise." She didn't know who had written it. She only knew it was passed from one detainee to another, a fragile prayer circulating through despair. As the lights dimmed and the buses rolled closer, a guard's voice echoed, names starting with A through M, outside. Marisol's hands trembled as she stood. The sound of the gate opening was both a beginning and an ending. And as that gate creaked wide, the camera of our story follows her, not for pity, but for truth. Because somewhere beyond that chain-link fence lies a system most will never see. Lean in now, as we begin to uncover what really happens when borders close and people disappear between them.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
The sun dipped low over the small town of Chiquimula in eastern Guatemala, where the air hung heavy with the sound of cicadas and the clatter of buses bound north. For years, those buses had been symbols of escape. For Marisol, they were her only chance to rewrite her story. Her life before the journey was simple. She woke before dawn, made tortillas over a rusted stove, and worked long hours in the cane fields. Each night she'd sit beside her daughter's bed, reading stories about faraway cities and bright lights she'd never seen. She promised that one day they'd go there together. But poverty has a way of stealing time, and one day, her promises began to feel like lies. Marisol's ordinary world was built on two fragile pillars, guilt and hope. Guilt for leaving her daughter behind, and hope that leaving might somehow make everything better. When she boarded that van for Mexico, she believed she was heading toward a life where her child would never have to go hungry again. She had no idea that her path north would end in a detention hall filled with despair. Mexico had long been a country people passed through, not one they were sent back to. But over the past few years, something changed. Under mounting pressure from the United States, the Mexican government began to take a harder stance on migration. Reports showed that by early 2025, Mexico had already received nearly 40,000 deportees from the U.S., including thousands from Central America, part of a growing collaboration to stem the northbound flow. The policy was written in bureaucratic language, but on the ground it looked like panic. In border towns like Tapachula and Tenasique, shelters overflowed. New ones were built in a rush, sometimes just tents lined along dirt roads. Volunteers spoke of children sleeping on cardboard, of families torn apart in the confusion. Even officials admitted off-record that the system was breaking. Marisol met people whose stories mirrored hers. Carlos, a man in his 30s, had once lived in Texas. He was deported after 10 years in the U.S., sent back to Mexico with no family, no documents, no plan. "They told me to start over," he said quietly, "but I don't know where to start from." Then there was Ana, a soft-spoken volunteer at the Tapachula shelter. She moved like someone who'd seen too much and still refused to stop caring. She tried to keep spirits alive with laughter and shared meals, but even she confessed one night, "It's getting worse every week. We can't keep up." And somewhere inside the system was Luis, an immigration officer who had spent 20 years behind a government desk. He followed the rules, signed the papers, and closed the files. But lately, something in those files kept him awake. He'd begun to see the same names appear twice, sometimes 3 times, people supposedly deported, then missing altogether. He'd started keeping copies of the records, small acts of rebellion against a machine too large to fight. For all of them, the border was more than a line. It was a mirror reflecting everything they feared and everything they dreamed of. Marisol often thought back to the morning she left home. She remembered her daughter's tiny hands gripping her skirt, asking, "Mama, when will you come back?" She had smiled and said, "Soon." But she had no idea what soon meant in a world where promises were currency and hope was contraband. She'd borrowed money to make the trip, promising to pay it back once she found work. Now, sitting in a detention cell miles from her dream, she realized she might never see her daughter again. In the silence of those holding rooms, people spoke in whispers. They traded stories of betrayal, of violence, of the gangs waiting for them on the other side. "If I go back," one man said, "they'll kill me before I reach my street." His words hung in the air like a truth too heavy to carry. Even Luis, the officer, couldn't look away anymore. One night, while reviewing files, he found an internal memo labeled "Third Country Returns." It described agreements allowing migrants from Central America to be processed through Mexico before being sent home, often without proper hearings or legal counsel. He read it twice, then slid it into his pocket. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the first flicker of courage. All across the country, engines rumbled, buses filled, and paperwork flowed. And in every line, in every name, was someone's story, someone like Marisol. As you listen, think about this. What would your ordinary world look like if one morning it became the staging ground for someone else's desperate journey? It's a question that echoes in the silence of the border towns, where the line between law and loss blurs more each day. Lean in now, as we begin to uncover the moment that shattered that fragile balance, the incident that turned Mexico's migration crisis into something far more dangerous. The first alarm came just after midnight. In a narrow detention wing at the shelter in Tapachula, Marisol awoke to the shrill ring of a public address system. Through the darkness she heard names called in rapid succession. The guards flicked on the lights. Doors opened. Buses idled beyond the fence. She didn't know the full reason yet, only the words, "Mass deportation begins immediately." She thought it was someone's nightmare. Then she noticed the others, families with children, older women wrapped in blankets, men with hollow eyes, all loading onto the buses with only the clothes on their backs. The guards showed no smiles, no promises. A woman wept openly and the cry seemed to echo off the concrete walls, gathering into something awful. For Marisol, this was the moment her fragile hope shattered. In the months leading to this midnight alarm, the government of Mexico had intensified its preparation, large-scale shelters in border and transit cities, new reception centers for deportees, shifts in policy to accept non-Mexican nationals sent back from the United States. It was no longer a gradual change, it was now a trigger. On the morning trucks rolled into Tapachula's main plaza, migrants were sorted, Mexican nationals first, then Central Americans, then a growing number of third-country nationals whose origins lay further south. The sign above one bus read simply Hacia Central America, towards Central America. That label carried the weight of loss. Marisol's van, packed hours earlier with hope and silence, had arrived. But instead of taking her north, it redirected her west, then south, out of Mexico's busiest transit corridor. She realized, the new system was no accident. A government push, in partnership with the U.S. and Central American states, meant that Mexico was not merely intercepting migrants, it was forcibly redirecting them. On the blackboard of border politics, the message was clear: don't come, and if you have come, we'll send you back. Carlos, the man we met earlier, had just 6 hours before received the memo on his phone. He was scheduled for repatriation and would leave at dawn for a Central American country, despite being told originally he would restart life in Mexico. He asked the guard, "Why?" "I have a case pending." The guard simply said, "New directive. The bus leaves." He stood, expression blank, as the other men shuffled in fear around him. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, Luis sat behind his desk late into the night. He had just seen the raw numbers. In the prior quarter, the number of returnees from the U.S. to Mexico had skyrocketed, shelters had been filled and emptied in cycles, official logs showed third-country returns. Suddenly, the ledger appended CA, Central America. He didn't fully understand yet what it meant, but he appalled to the realization, thousands of Central Americans were now being sent back via Mexico to their home countries under new arrangements. The system he served had become a conveyor belt of removal. In the early hours, Marisol boarded the bus. The seats were filth-stained, the air heavy with despair. She clutched the photo of her daughter, hidden in her pocket, wondering if she would ever see her again. At the toll station, the bus slowed, guards boarded and checked names. One of them asked her, "Why would you risk coming north if you have a family?" She couldn't answer. The question hung heavy like an unreturned favor. Suddenly, at a checkpoint, the bus diverted, not toward the Guatemala border as she expected, but toward a remote border crossing she had never heard of. The engine shut down. Someone whispered, the other route collapsed. "We go via Hala." Anxiety hushed the passengers. A mother asked her son softly, "Will we see Mexico again?" He said nothing. This diversion, this routing through unfamiliar terrain, was a key moment. The system was being re-engineered. Mexico's government had publicly acknowledged preparing shelters in northern cities for deportees from the U.S., but less attention was paid to the process of returning Central Americans deeper into the region. What was once a transit corridor was now a deportation pipeline. As the bus crossed the border into Guatemala, Marisol looked out the window at the dark horizon. She remembered the afternoon she left Chiquimula, promising her daughter a new life. Now she thought, maybe home was not what I left, maybe home is what I lose. She reflected on her journey and asked herself, if you lost your only way forward, would you turn back or keep walking into the unknown? That question wasn't for the guards, the policymakers, or the whispers in the halls of government, it was for you. Share in the comments what you think. How far is too far before you stop hoping? As dawn broke, the bus crossed the Rio Suciate. The border guards checked nothing. No hearings, no interviews. Just a stamp and a barcode. Marisol felt the weight of her dreams slipping out of her fingers. She didn't know where this road would end, only that she had no stake in it. And so begins the unraveling of this border machine, where lives are moved like pieces on a board, and the cost is human. Lean in now as we begin to uncover how far this system will go, and who will pay the price. Night had worn its darkness thin over the detention dorms in Tapachula, but inside the walls the quiet was heavy, so heavy you could hear the weight of every question unasked. Marisol, still clutching her daughter's photo, watched others quietly exchange stories, half-formed and trembling. They did not trust the words of the guards, yet they whispered anyway. They had to. Because no one else was listening. Carlos had arrived in Mexico months ago with a heart full of ambition. He envisioned a small job, a modest room, and the possibility of sending his wages home. Now he found himself in a shelter beside men who spoke of third-country returns. He overheard one say, "We didn't come here from Mexico. We came through to the U.S. But they won't let us stay." He asked again, "What is a third-country return?" The man shrugged. "I don't know. They just bus us south." Meanwhile, Luis in Mexico City sat in his office late into the night, paging through files. The ledger entries seemed straightforward at first: names, origination country, destination. But recently, additional columns had appeared: return route, CA, route code, SD29, duration, 48H. These cryptic notations did more than confuse, they frightened him. Larry Klein of the Migration Policy Institute had called this the forgotten side of deportation, the idea that once migrants are removed from a country, what happens to them next is rarely tracked. Marisol's world began to tilt when the bus diverted toward Guatemala at the border crossing. But nothing could have prepared her for the empty seats on that deportation bus. Empty seats were meant for those who had been processed, approved, released. Instead, the seat back pockets held nothing but dread. Either the route had changed, or the system had. Luis remembered the morning he found the memo: Mexico has repeatedly denied allowing U.S. military flights deporting migrants to land on its territory. He sat up in the dark and scribbled in the margin, "If we don't land the plane, how will the migrants get home?" He had no answer. In one shelter, an older woman shared what she'd heard from a volunteer: they were expecting mass returns within days. Several cities in northern Mexico had erected shelters specifically for incoming deportees. In January 2025, the government announced tents in Ciudad Juarez to receive as many as thousands of Mexicans deported from the U.S. Yet for Central American migrants the story was different: they were diverted, expedited, returned without fanfare. The system that seemed designed to catch migrants at the northern border had quietly pivoted south. Among the detainees in the pens, Marisol heard murmurs of bus to Honduras tomorrow, Guatemala today, El Salvador next week. No hearings. No paperwork. Just a stamped card in motion. The man beside her said in a low voice, "They told me I cannot stay in Mexico. So they send me home." But home for me wasn't Guatemala anymore, it was hope. The deeper mystery: why now? Why Mexico, once a transit space, suddenly became a reversal chute? Analysts pointed to a shift in U.S. strategy: more deportations, wider reach, more pressure on Mexico to accept not just its own nationals but non-Mexicans. President Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico acknowledged that the country had received non-Mexican deportees from the U.S. in early 2025. She noted that the majority were Mexican, but the door had opened. And inside those shelters, the question that haunted them all was this: where do you go when your transit country becomes your return country? That question didn't sit politely at the table, it hung above it, demanding to be answered. Have you ever thought about what happens when the line you cross north becomes the line you cross back south? Let us know below. Carlos, now marking days on a calendar in his shelter bunk, realized something else. The shelves of files in Mexico City, the ledger codes, the tent camps, these were not just reactive. They were planned. The report at the Baker Institute on the social and economic effects of mass deportations warned that large-scale removals have long-term costs far beyond what meets the eye. Mexico's economy, its labor forces, the families left behind, they all felt the pressure. Marisol watched a family cluster by the wall: a mother, father, 2 children. They had arrived in Mexico with hope of crossing to the U.S., only to be told last night that they had to return. The children huddled. The mother said nothing. The father rubbed the youngest's hair and whispered, "We'll start again. Somewhere. Somehow." Their forced retreat felt like an ambush. Luis, as he dug further, found statistical shifts. The United States recorded lower daily apprehensions at its southwest border, 264 per day in March 2025, down 94% compared to March 2024. But fewer arrivals didn't mean fewer removals. The system had shifted from catching those trying to cross north to pushing those already in Mexico back south. The machinery had reversed its direction, but the human cost remained. One night in the hostel dorm, Marisol tapped on the frame of the photo of her daughter. She asked aloud, though no one answered, "If your path forward is closed, what becomes your journey?" It wasn't just her question. It was theirs. The line between migrants and deportees blurred. And in the silent halls of shelters and buses and ledger books, the machinery of return roared quietly. And so the mystery deepens. Who sets the rules? Who collects the names? Who decides that hope is a border violation? What happens when the system you pass through becomes the system that passes you back? Lean in now, as the full twist of this system emerges, and the cost finally hits home. Mid-morning in Mexico City. The office light was cold, the hum of the ventilation system filled the stale air. Luis sat at his desk, halfway through a mug of lukewarm coffee, when the folder slipped beneath the door arrived. He didn't recognize the sender. The file wasn't marked urgent, yet he felt the hairs on his neck rise. He opened it. Inside were photographs, spreadsheets, route codes, bus manifests, and then one page that changed everything: a list of migrants from Honduras and El Salvador, with a column labeled Destination, AC Zone. AC, Alta Celeridad. High speed. It was the code name for a deportation pipeline rerouting migrants through Mexico out to Central America without proper processing. Luis's world shook. Up until then he believed the policy shifts were messy, but lawful. Yes, shelters were overloaded. Yes, new agreements were in place with the U.S. and Central American governments. For example, Mexico had publicly acknowledged receiving non-Mexican migrants from the U.S. as of late January 2025. But what he now realized was buried. The government wasn't just returning people to their home countries, they were sending them through Mexico in a circuitous loop, making Mexico the deportation conduit, rather than the shipment origin or final destination. At the same moment, Marisol sat on the edge of the bus's last stop before the Suchiate River crossing. She stared at the barbed wire, at the water, at the plain barcode stamped on her wrist. She had believed she was en route back to Chiquimula. Instead they were rerouting her towards something neither home nor safe. The guard seated in front of her just whispered, "Third stop, Tapachula Transit Center." She realized there was no line north, and there may be no line back. Meanwhile, Carlos in the shelter bunk heard the rumor, flight starting tomorrow. Direct to Guatemala from Ciudad Juarez. He remembered the memo that he'd been handed, return route, CA-08. CA for Central America. It was supposed to read return to Mexico. But the code said otherwise. He confronted one of the officers. "Why Guatemala?" "I'm Honduran." The officer shrugged. "Route full. Next leg leaves tonight." It was the moment Carlos understood his processing was outsourced, his fate predetermined. But the biggest betrayal came when Luis compared the shapes of the dossiers. The Mexico Embraces You program was public, providing vouchers, reintegration services for deported Mexicans. Yet the pipeline revealed thousands of Central American migrants who were never supposed to be in Mexico's reintegration system. They were treated as transit deportees, moved from U.S. custody or border detention, across Mexico, and into Central America, often within 48 hours. According to one policy brief, the future for returnees to Mexico and Central America remains largely ignored by policymakers. In that moment, Luis felt his faith in the system collapse. He collected the documents, copied them, locked them in a drawer. Outside his window the traffic rolled by, ignorant of the breaking ground beneath. Marisol's bus ground along a dusty road. She glanced left at the children sleeping, right at the men who had once dared to dream of the U.S., now pretending they could sleep. She overheard a father say to his son, "Remember when we thought going north was brave?" The son slept through the words. Her phone vibrated once. A message, welfare check delayed. She'd asked for help weeks ago for her daughter. Now she realized the message meant nothing. The system that once tracked her was silent. Instead of aiding her journey, her government had become the route. Reflecting on everything she had left, her scarred past in Guatemala, her dreams of reconnection, the photo in her pocket, Marisol felt the twist settle. She was not being returned. She was being rerouted. And it wasn't just her. Hundreds of migrants had taken the same path. The files Luis held showed that in the first quarter of 2025, northern border intake centers were recording a steep rise in immediate cross-border transfers to detention centers in southern Mexico and onward to Central America, many without asylum hearings or legal aid. For the authorities, the narrative was cooperation among nations to manage migration flows. But for the people, it was a conveyor belt. Luis realized this system turned hope into something manageable, predictable, and disposable. At that intersection, the question struck, when the country you pass through becomes the country that sends you back, is it still migration, or is it forced removal? In the shelter, Marisol asked Ana, the volunteer, "Who decides our destination?" Ana hesitated. "We don't. We just route you." The admission hit like a blow. That's when the story cracked open. The actors behind the scenes, the governments, the shelters, the transport systems, weren't just responding to migration. They were redesigning it. The pipeline of removal had become a machine. And in one final reveal for this moment, Luis found an internal memo marked "Seal, Confidential, Discuss only with Director." It listed Mexico's southern corridors, bus codes, and a capacity plan for rapid movement of non-Mexican returnees through Mexican territory, a plan that extended far beyond policy briefs or public statements. It was a blueprint. For Marisol, this meant there would be no hearing, no goodbye to the daughter she missed, no pause to breathe. The bus surged forward. She pressed the photo of her child to her chest and let herself drift into an unasked question. How do you fight a machine that rewrote your journey while you were on it? And now, as the twist settles, we can't turn away. The system's face may be hidden in spreadsheets and late-night directives, but its impact is very real. Who will pull the lever? Who will claim responsibility? Lean in now, because the darkest part of this story is about to unfold, and it's not just about deportation. It's about the silence that follows when you're moved so quickly, you don't know whether you've arrived or been sent away. The night rain came hard over southern Mexico. It sounded like static against the tin roofs of the Tapachula transit shelters, an endless hiss that drowned voices, prayers, and even dreams. Marisol sat awake on her cot, staring at the half-lit corridor where a guard's boots echoed with slow authority. Around her, exhausted families slept in thin blankets, their faces drawn tight with hunger and disbelief. Earlier that evening, she had asked a volunteer for her processing number. The woman had smiled wearily. "Your file was rerouted," she said. "You're scheduled for transfer at dawn." "Transfer to where?" "South," the woman replied softly. South, that word again. It used to mean home. Now it meant oblivion. Carlos, from across the hall, overheard the exchange. His hands shook as he clutched his own stamped card. No date. No destination. Just CA Zone 04. He had tried to call his brother in San Pedro Sula, but the line never connected. The local radio in the shelter blared faint news reports, Mexico increasing deportations to Central America under fast-track agreements, meant to manage migration surges after the U.S. reimposed border limits earlier in 2025. Luis meanwhile sat alone in his apartment in Mexico City, his desk covered with torn folders and cold coffee mugs. His hands hovered over his phone. Should he leak the documents? He thought about his wife asleep in the next room, unaware of the secrets that could shatter their peace. He turned on the TV for distraction. The news anchor read the latest report. Mexico continues mass deportations of Central American migrants amid growing pressure from the United States. Authorities have deported over 28,000 migrants in the last quarter alone. Luis felt sick. The number was real, confirmed by the National Migration Institute's own statement, now public domain. It matched the internal manifests he'd seen weeks earlier. His stomach tightened. He realized the blueprint wasn't theory anymore, it was already in motion. The next morning, Marisol's group was woken before sunrise. "Pack everything," a guard ordered. They were herded into a line outside the shelter gate, rain still falling, puddles reflecting the dim glow of bus headlights. No one spoke. Children cried softly, an older man whispered a prayer. Marisol looked for Carlos but couldn't see him through the crowd. When she finally found him, he mouthed, "Don't let go." But she did. Because a guard pushed between them, scanning wristbands. Hers blinked red, CA08. His blinked green, hold. 2 directions. 2 fates. As her bus pulled away, she caught one last glimpse of Carlos's face, rain mixing with his tears. And for the first time since leaving Guatemala, she let herself cry, silently, violently, into the sleeve of her jacket. Back in Mexico City, Luis printed copies of the secret memo and sealed them in an envelope. He left his apartment, rain dripping from the rooftops above, and walked toward the metro station. He planned to meet a journalist from an independent news outlet known for covering migration issues, Animal Politico. But halfway through the tunnel, 2 men in suits intercepted him. "Señor Hernandez?" "Yes?" "Come with us." He never reached the journalist. The file was taken. His phone confiscated. The next morning, his desk at the Migration Institute was cleared, administrative reassignment. That was the official term. Luis realized then that the system didn't just process migrants, it processed dissent. By now, Marisol's bus had crossed the Suchiate River Bridge, heading deeper into Guatemala. The road was slick with mud, the rain still unrelenting. She pressed her forehead to the window and whispered her daughter's name like a prayer. She had nothing left, no allies, no plan, not even the certainty of what country she'd wake up in tomorrow. She reached into her pocket and felt the crumpled photograph, her daughter, smiling in front of a broken wall back home. That small square of memory was all she carried from a life she could barely return to. Hours later, at a dusty checkpoint, soldiers ordered everyone off the bus. One by one, they were processed, no IDs, no questions, just numbers. The officer in charge called out, "Guatemalans, to the left. Hondurans, to the right." Marisol hesitated. Her ID was gone. She tried to explain she was Guatemalan, but the soldier barely looked up. "No documents, no country," he muttered, waving her toward the other's group. She obeyed. That phrase, "no country," clung to her like a curse. For years, she had believed that borders were lines drawn by governments. Now she understood, sometimes borders are drawn inside you. Meanwhile, Luis sat at home in silence that night, staring at the empty drawer where the folder used to be. His career, his credibility, his courage, all burned away. He thought of the faces in the documents, the people rerouted south, the children asleep on buses. His phone buzzed once. A message, and signed. "The pipeline doesn't stop. It expands." He dropped the phone. In Tapachula, Carlos's bunk was empty. No one knew whether he had been released or rerouted. The volunteers didn't ask questions anymore. Asking was dangerous. By now, the machinery of deportation had become so efficient that migrants were removed before local shelters could even record their names. Every new bus carried people further south, away from the spotlight. The walls of the shelter were silent, the kind of silence that only bureaucracies and broken promises can make. And through it all, the same thought haunted Luis, Marisol, and anyone who still dared to care: how do you fight something that operates in darkness and calls it order? Maybe that's the question for all of us, too. When systems erase people in the name of progress, who becomes invisible next? Outside, dawn crept over Tapachula. The buses idled again. Another round of transfers, another round of names turned to numbers. The sky was gray, not with storm clouds this time, but with ash from the burning trash heaps along the roadside. A fitting color for a morning where everything seemed lost. And yet, beneath the despair, something small still flickered. Marisol held her daughter's photo tight, whispering, "You'll know my name." She didn't know what came next, only that she refused to vanish quietly. Marisol held her daughter's photo tight, whispering, "You'll know my name." She didn't know what came next, only that she refused to vanish quietly. The world outside was still gray, but somewhere beyond those clouds, something was shifting, an awakening, fragile but real. Because when systems erase people, survival itself becomes rebellion. And what comes next will make even silence speak. Morning broke over the Guatemalan highlands like a bruise turning to light. The bus that carried Marisol and 30 others rattled along a cracked road lined with sugarcane and dust. Each bump seemed to shake loose another fragment of her past, the years she'd worked, dreamed, and dared. But this morning was different. Something inside her had shifted. At the last checkpoint before Chiquimula, the bus stopped for fuel. The driver barked orders, guards stepped off for coffee. For the first time in days, the migrants sat unmonitored. Marisol pressed her forehead to the glass and whispered to the man across the aisle, "Do you have a phone?" He shook his head. Then, from the row behind, a young woman slid forward, clutching a hidden device wrapped in cloth. "Quick," she whispered. Marisol's fingers trembled as she unlocked the screen. The woman had already opened a social media feed, headlines scrolling fast. Mexico launches new wave of deportations, humanitarian groups raise alarm. Central American governments overwhelmed by mass returns. Families separated in cross-border transfers. Her heart pounded. These weren't rumors anymore. The world knew. The machine that had swallowed her name was finally visible. In Mexico City, Luis had spent weeks under surveillance, reassigned to a meaningless desk job in the archives. Every file he touched reminded him of the one that was taken. But one evening, while reviewing a shipment manifest, he spotted a familiar code at the top corner, ACZ08/transit complete/verified. The signature at the bottom was his own, forged. Someone was using his identity to validate the same deportation pipeline he had tried to expose. He leaned back in his chair, hands shaking. The realization tore through him like cold fire. They had erased his role in the system by making him complicit. But maybe that was also their mistake, because now he knew exactly how the chain worked, from policy to execution. And he still had one copy of the old blueprint hidden away. That night, he sat at his kitchen table and reopened an encrypted email draft to a journalist he once trusted. His finger hovered over the send button. He thought of Marisol, not by name, not by face, but as one of the thousands represented in those cold numbers. Then he pressed send. Back on the Guatemalan road, Marisol's bus rolled into a checkpoint manned not by soldiers, but by volunteers from a local NGO. She spotted their vests, bright orange with the word Refugio. As the passengers were ordered off the bus, one volunteer recognized the panic in her eyes and whispered, "Are you deported or in transit?" "I don't know anymore," Marisol replied. "Then you're one of ours," the woman said, taking her hand. It was the first time in weeks that anyone had spoken to her as if she were human. Meanwhile, Luis's leak began to move. Independent reporters in Mexico and Honduras started publishing pieces linking Mexico's new rapid deportation corridors with confidential agreements across Central America. They cited internal memos, capacity plans, route maps, the very documents Luis had risked everything to share. The story caught fire online. Public outrage followed. Mexico's National Migration Institute issued a statement denying any wrongdoing, but the pressure was on. Inside the shelters, phones buzzed. People were talking. For the first time, the silence cracked. Marisol saw a crowd gather around a radio in the NGO safe house. The announcer spoke Spanish fast and urgent. Authorities face investigation into secret deportation transfers. Human rights observers demand transparency. Whistleblower leaks expose hidden routes. She closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was validation. The world finally saw them. Across the border, in a dim apartment, Luis watched the same broadcast and felt a mix of fear and pride. He knew the danger. But when he heard the anchor say, "Documents obtained from a source within the National Migration Institute reveal the existence of internal codes linked to unauthorized removals," he smiled through his exhaustion. The truth had a voice now. For both of them, the shift was quiet but seismic. Marisol realized she could no longer wait to be rescued. "They wanted to erase us," she told one of the NGO workers. "Then we'll make noise." She volunteered to help others arriving at the shelter, mothers like her, lost, unsure, trembling. She translated, guided, soothed. Her hands, once symbols of helplessness, became instruments of action. At night, she would sit outside beneath the stars, whispering her daughter's name to the sky. "I'll find you," she said. Not as a plea anymore, as a promise. And in Mexico City, Luis walked home one evening through the soft drizzle of summer rain. He stopped at a bus stop and saw something that made him freeze, a small flyer pasted to the shelter wall, "Help for deportees. Refuge starts here." The bottom corner bore the same NGO name that had helped Marisol, Refugio. He didn't know her, and she didn't know him. But their actions were now connected, one leak, one act of defiance, one human story breaking through the bureaucratic fog. Sometimes courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it begins as a whisper, a mother asking for her child, an employee refusing to stay silent. And together, those whispers become the sound of change. Because when the system builds walls, truth finds a way to climb. And in that small but undeniable ascent, something unbreakable is born. Rain hammered the tin roof of the NGO shelter as Marisol helped organize a list of missing migrants. The names blurred together, Ana, Jorge, Luz, Mateo, but when she reached the last page, her heart stopped. Scrawled in blue ink was her daughter's name, Lucia Alvarez, listed under unverified returnees. Next to it, a handwritten note read, "Last seen in Tapachula Detention Center. April." Her pulse thundered in her ears. April, the same month she'd been deported. She ran to the shelter coordinator, clutching the paper. "This name, this is my daughter." The woman's eyes widened. "We're compiling that list for the press. Don't lose it. Things are moving fast." Outside, chaos brewed. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions as police and immigration officials flooded the area. The leak Luis had triggered was now national news. The investigation exposed a network of forged deportation documents, signatures duplicated, transfer logs erased, and falsified detention records used to deport migrants without proper hearings. Thousands had been sent away in silence, their files altered to make the operation look lawful. Inside the Institute's headquarters in Mexico City, Luis faced interrogation. His supervisor slammed a folder onto the desk. "You leaked this? You think you're a hero?" Luis didn't answer. The room smelled of sweat and printer ink. "You've ruined years of coordination. You've put lives in danger," the man hissed. Luis's voice was quiet but unflinching. "No. You did that when you turned people into paperwork." The room went silent. The official's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you've done." Luis met his gaze. "Maybe for the first time, I do." Meanwhile, across the border, Marisol and several volunteers boarded a van heading toward Tapachula. The road wound through soaked mountain passes, and each mile felt like walking into a memory. They arrived at the detention center by dawn. Guards blocked the entrance, but cameras and journalists were everywhere now, broadcasting live. For the first time, the gates were open to public scrutiny. A reporter interviewed Marisol near the fence. "Why did you come back?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Because they took everything, even my name. But not my voice. That's still mine." Her words spread quickly online, shared and subtitled across social media. Within hours, #WhereIsLucia began trending. Inside the facility, a sudden commotion broke out, records being examined, staff questioned, supervisors panicking. Luis's documents had reached the press, forcing the government to acknowledge the forged deportation codes. Each line of evidence tied the scandal to officials who had signed away lives for efficiency's sake. And then, just past noon, a shelter volunteer ran out of the compound holding a tablet. "Marisol," she shouted. "We found her, Lucia. On the screen was a live stream from another shelter near Honduras. A teenage girl sat with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, dazed but alive. The coordinator spoke softly. "We traced her through the same false deportation ID that started this investigation." Marisol fell to her knees. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The volunteers surrounded her, some crying, some cheering. It was a moment both shattering and whole, the reunion not of place, but of truth. In Mexico City, Luis watched the broadcast on an old television in a cafe. He smiled faintly, relief and exhaustion flooding his face. Around him, strangers watched too, people sipping coffee, whispering, shaking their heads at the horror of what had been hidden for so long. And somewhere deep down, he knew this wasn't victory. It was exposure. The kind that forces nations to look at themselves. As night fell, reporters gathered outside government buildings. Officials promised reforms, transparency, justice. But behind every speech were faces, the ones like Marisol's, who had lived through the silence. A narrator's voice fades in, almost like a reflection carried on the wind. When truth finally breaks through, it doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like names being spoken again. One by one. Out loud. And as the camera pans across the rain-soaked streets, another question lingers, not shouted, but whispered to the viewer. What would you do if the system erased you, and the only way back was to make the world listen? Because sometimes justice isn't found in courts or laws. Sometimes, it's born in the courage to be seen. And that courage, once awakened, never goes silent again. Weeks passed since the headlines first broke. The story that began in chaos, with buses full of frightened families and the hum of drones at the southern border, had now spread across the world. News anchors replayed footage of reunions, mothers finding their children, sons recognizing fathers through fences. The phrase "no one is illegal in dignity" painted cardboard signs across every protest square from Mexico City to Los Angeles. The investigation Luis sparked forced the Mexican government to suspend senior immigration officers. Guatemala and Honduras opened humanitarian corridors for deportees. But the real victory didn't come from offices or speeches. It came from the people who refused to disappear. Luis sat in a quiet cafe in Mexico City, a notebook open before him. He wasn't writing reports anymore, only truth. He'd been suspended from his job at the Institute, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, his words were his own. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. "They're safe. In the shelter near San Pedro Sula. She remembers you helped her mother. Gracias." Luis smiled, not wide, just enough for the ache in his chest to ease. He typed back softly, "Tell her, the world finally heard her name." Far south, beneath a blooming jacaranda tree, Marisol stood with her daughter. Lucia, thinner, older, but alive. The air smelled of rain and dust, and for the first time since her deportation, Marisol let herself breathe without fear. Around them, children played with donated toys. Volunteers handed out food. The world, just for a heartbeat, felt almost kind again. A journalist approached her, microphone trembling slightly in the wind. "Why do you keep telling your story?" he asked. Marisol looked at her daughter, then at the camera. Her voice was calm. "I thought we were invisible," she said. "But we never were. We just needed someone to look." That line, "we just needed someone to look," played that night across television screens around the world. It became the headline, the quote that carried her story beyond the shelters and the border checkpoints. Behind every number, behind every deportation statistic, was a face, a voice, a heartbeat. Luis watched the interview from his small apartment, rain streaking the window beside him. He didn't smile this time. He just listened. The sound of her voice filled the room, breaking through the static. Maybe justice wasn't about winning. Maybe it was simply about being seen. Because when you speak truth into a system built on silence, even a whisper can sound like thunder. And maybe that's what justice really looks like, not in courtrooms or press conferences, but in the quiet return of a name. A mother's embrace. A truth restored. The documentary narration returns, calm, solemn, steady. In 2025, Mexico began mass deportations of illegal migrants, sending thousands to Central America. For many, it was a one-way journey into silence. But voices like Marisol's changed that, turning a humanitarian crisis into a reckoning. Today, international organizations still follow the aftermath of those deportations, demanding transparency, compassion, and reform. The voice softens. Some borders are drawn on maps. Others are drawn in fear. But the hardest borders to cross are the ones we build around who matters, and who doesn't. A long pause. Only the sound of distant rain. Then the question, quiet, haunting, meant for whoever is listening. If the system erased you, would you have the strength to make the world listen? The music rises, low strings, steady heartbeat percussion. And the final words fade in. Every border has a story. This one had a heartbeat. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.